In October 1913, on a train somewhere in Switzerland, a 38-year-old psychiatrist named Carl Gustav Jung looked out the window and saw the countryside drowning. Not literally, he knew that, and that's exactly what unsettled him. He saw, in a waking vision he could not stop and did not summon, a flood of blood rising over Europe, swallowing towns, floating corpses and debris from one horizon to the other. He was already, by that point, one of the most respected psychiatrists in Europe, heir apparent to Sigmund Freud, a man who had spent a decade at the Berkeley Hospital in Zurich diagnosing exactly this kind of break from consensus reality in other people. He wrote the vision down, dated it, and told almost no one. 10 months later, the actual war started, and European soil did in fact run with more blood than anyone alive had ever seen. Jung would spend the rest of that decade unsure whether he had glimpsed something real bleeding backward through time, or whether he was simply the latest psychiatrist to lose his own footing studying the minds of the mad, a fear that, given his job, was not abstract. He worked under Eugen Bleuler, the man who had coined the term schizophrenia only a few years earlier, and Jung was fluent enough in the clinical picture of psychotic break to recognize its features assembling in his own mind, week by week, with nowhere safe to say so out loud. What Jung did next, over the following 16 years, was write it all down anyway, thousands of pages, eventually transcribed by hand into a large red leather folio with his own illuminated calligraphy and paintings, a book he titled Liber Novus, the new book, known to the world today as the Red Book. Inside it, one figure appears again and again, an old man with the wings of a kingfisher, carrying keys, who introduced himself to Jung during a waking fantasy, and then simply kept returning, day after day, on Jung's walks through his garden, offering ideas Jung insisted he had not consciously invented. Jung named him Philemon, and in 1916, in a single, strange, 3-evening burst that Jung himself compared to something closer to dictation than composition, he wrote a short text called The 7 Sermons to the Dead, which he did not sign with his own name. He attributed it instead to Basilides, an actual historical figure, a Gnostic teacher who ran a school in Alexandria around the year 120, whose ideas survive today only in fragments quoted by the Christian heresy hunters who wrote against him. In that text, Basilides, Jung, wearing a dead man's name, describes a force standing above and beyond the god of light and the devil of darkness alike, a force neither good nor evil but both at once, the true underlying engine of the created world, the thing the visible god of religion is merely a partial mask for. He names it. He calls it Abraxas. Later scholars of Jung's work, reading it against the wider history of Gnosticism, would call it exactly what it structurally is: Jung's own version of the Demiurge, the flawed, half-blind architect god that Gnostic cosmology places between humanity and a truer, unreachable source. Jung did not find this concept in a library first. By his own account, and by the account of the historians who have since reconstructed his private journals in detail, he found it already waiting for him, fully formed, inside his own visions, years before he had done any serious reading in actual Gnostic source material. He recognized the shape of an ancient heresy rising up out of his own psyche before he had confirmed, from outside evidence, that the ancient heresy had ever really said anything like it. That sequence, the vision first, the historical confirmation years later, is the part of this story almost nobody tells accurately, and it's the part that makes it worth 2 hours of your time, rather than a 5-minute clip with a fear-baiting title. I want to be precise about what actually happened here, because Jung himself was tormented, for most of the rest of his life by exactly the question you might be forming right now. Was any of it real? Not metaphorically real, not real in the soft, deflationary way people use the word to avoid a harder question. Jung wanted to know, as a scientist, whether Philemon and Abraxas and the rest of the figures crowding his visions were autonomous psychic entities with a genuine independent existence inside the structure of the human mind. Something closer to what earlier ages called spirits. Or whether he was simply constructing an elaborate, symptom-consistent fantasy on the exact model of the psychotic patients he treated every day at the clinic. He never fully resolved that question, and he said so on the record more than once. What he did resolve, methodically, deliberately, and in a way you can actually learn and use, was a technique for doing this kind of work without losing the thread back to ordinary consciousness. A technique he eventually called active imagination, developed directly out of his own most dangerous years, later refined by his students into something teachable, testable, and still practiced today by working analysts and, in simpler forms, by people with no clinical training at all. Here's what happened to the book itself, because it's the real suppression story hiding underneath this topic, and it doesn't need a single invented detail to be unsettling. Jung worked on the Red Book from 1913 until roughly 1930, then set it aside unfinished and never published it in his lifetime. He let a small handful of friends and family read from it. He gave away, as gifts, a tiny private printing of the 7 sermons, 50 copies, no public sale, distributed only to people he trusted. When he died in 1961, his family took the manuscript and locked it in a Swiss bank vault, and for the next several decades, access to the central document of Jung's entire inner life was denied to virtually everyone, including most of the professional Jungian analysts practicing his own method around the world. It took a historian named Sonu Shamdasani the better part of 3 years just to persuade the family. Specifically Jung's grandson, Ulrich Huerni, who controlled the estate, that releasing it would knock his grandfather's scientific reputation, and 13 more years after that to prepare the translation. The book finally reached the public in October 2009, 48 years after Jung's death, 80-some years after he stopped writing in it. Read that timeline again. This is not a claim about a lost gospel dug out of a jar by a farmer, dramatic as that story is on its own. This is the founder of one of the most influential schools of 20th century psychology, and his own family kept the primary evidence of how his ideas were actually generated hidden from the entire scientific and therapeutic community that built careers on top of it. For almost half a century, out of a specific articulable fear that if people saw what the visions actually looked like on the page, they would conclude Jung had simply been mentally ill, and that everything built on top of his theories, the archetypes, the collective unconscious, the whole architecture of Jungian psychology would collapse along with his credibility. That fear was not paranoid or invented for effect. It was reasonable, and Jung shared it about himself. In his own later account of this period, he described feeling, in his words, menaced by a psychosis, a phrase serious enough that one of his biographers, working from that same testimony, concluded Jung had, in clinical terms, actually experienced a form of psychotic break during these years. Reading the historian who later edited the Red Book, Shamdasani, has pushed back against directly, arguing the fuller documentation doesn't support that conclusion once you see the whole record rather than fragments. I'm not going to resolve that scholarly disagreement for you in the next few minutes, and neither will anyone else with intellectual honesty. It remains genuinely contested among people who have read every page of the primary material far more carefully than I have. What I can tell you, and what matters far more for what we're about to do together, is that Jung built, tested, refined, and eventually taught a specific, repeatable method for engaging exactly this kind of material, sustained, structured contact with autonomous feeling images and figures arising from the unconscious, in a way designed specifically to prevent the outcome he feared for himself. That technique did not stay locked in a Swiss vault. It became one of the standard tools of Jungian analytic practice, was later formalized into an accessible 4-step method by a Jungian analyst named Robert Johnson, in a widely available book most people can find, used for a few dollars, and shares more structural overlap with several evidence-based modern psychotherapy techniques than almost anyone teaching it online today bothers to mention. Over the next 2 hours or so, here is exactly what we're going to cover. We'll trace the real, documented history of how Jung's break with Freud in 1913 opened the door to 16 years of deliberate self-experimentation, and how a completely independent discovery, decades later, an ancient manuscript that ended up, almost by accident, being named after Jung himself, seemed to vindicate what he'd found in his own mind before he had any outside evidence it was anything more than private fantasy. We'll walk through the actual step-by-step technique of active imagination in enough detail that you could attempt a careful, contained first version of it tonight, along with the specific safety structure Jung and his successors built around it, precisely because the risk of losing your footing is real and was never treated casually by the people who developed this method professionally. We'll look at 3 levels of practice, from a first attempt that takes 15 minutes and ends with you writing 2 sentences, up to the kind of sustained, years-long engagement Jung and his closest students eventually undertook. We'll go through what modern psychology, largely working without any reference to Jung at all, has independently discovered about why structured imaginal dialogue with parts of your own mind produces measurable psychological change, and where that science stops and genuine philosophical uncertainty begins. Because Jung himself never fully closed that gap, and I'm not going to pretend I can close it for him. And we'll spend real time on the obstacles, what it actually feels like when this kind of work goes wrong, how professional analysts screen for who should and shouldn't attempt deep versions of it alone, and the honest, specific difference between rich imaginative work and a genuine break with reality, a distinction Jung cared about desperately, for the most personal reasons imaginable, and one you deserve to understand clearly rather than having it waved away by anyone telling you that you're specially prepared for something everyone else is too asleep to attempt. You are not chosen for this. Nobody watching this video has been selected by anything to encounter a demiurge in their own mind. What you have, simply by being a human being with an unconscious, which is to say, every human being who has ever lived is the same raw material Jung had. What almost nobody has is a map of what he actually did with it, drawn accurately, without the cheap mysticism or the manufactured dread that usually gets bolted onto this story to make it perform better online. Let's build that map from the ground up, starting with what actually happened in 1913, and why a man trained to diagnose madness in other people spent the next decade and a half deliberately walking toward the edge of it himself, on purpose, with a stopwatch and a journal. One more thing worth saying plainly before we go back in time. I'm not asking you to take my word for any of this. Everything in the historical sections that follow is drawn from material you can independently verify, Jung's own published autobiography, the Red Book as it now exists in full public translation, the biographical and archival scholarship of historians like Sonu Shamdasani, who spent literal decades with the primary documents, and the secondary literature of Jungian analysts who have written openly, including about the places where the record is genuinely uncertain or contested. Where historians disagree with each other, I'll tell you they disagree, rather than picking the version that makes for a cleaner story. Where Jung himself never resolved a question about his own experience, I'll tell you he never resolved it, rather than resolving it for him for the sake of a tidier video. That's a slower, less immediately dramatic way to tell this story than the version built purely to keep you watching through fear of missing something. I think it's also the only version worth 2 hours of anyone's actual time. Before we get to the break itself, it's worth understanding what Jung's professional footing actually was in 1913, because it's what made the following years so genuinely dangerous for him, rather than merely dramatic. He had joined the Burgardsley Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich in 1900, straight out of medical training, working directly under Eugen Bleuler, one of the most respected psychiatrists in Europe, and the man who in 1908 introduced the term schizophrenia into clinical language, replacing the older and even more pessimistic diagnostic category of dementia praecox. Jung spent nearly a decade at Burgardsley conducting some of the earliest serious experimental research into word association and unconscious complexes, work that first brought him to Freud's attention and that established his own scientific reputation independently, well before he became known primarily as Freud's collaborator. This matters for understanding what came later. Jung was not a mystic or an outsider dabbling in psychology. He was a rigorously trained clinical researcher who had spent years professionally distinguishing ordinary psychological distress from genuine psychotic breakdown in hundreds of real patients, which is exactly why his own encounter with vivid autonomous feeling in a material felt to him like walking directly toward the edge of a condition he understood clinically better than almost anyone alive. The break with Freud is the hinge everything else swings on, so it's worth getting the actual shape of it right rather than the cartoon version. Jung and Freud had been close collaborators for roughly 6 years, with Freud at one point openly describing Jung as his intended successor, the man who would carry psychoanalysis forward after him. Their falling out was not one dramatic argument, but an accumulating set of theoretical and personal ruptures, disagreements over the nature of the libido, over how much weight to give religious and mythological material as opposed to purely sexual etiology, and a personal relationship that had grown strained under the weight of Freud's expectations and Jung's need for intellectual independence. By the end of 1913, the correspondence between them had effectively stopped, and Jung, not yet 40, found himself without the professional scaffolding that had structured his entire adult career. He stepped back from many of his official duties and, in his own later description, entered a period some biographers have called a creative illness, and others have called something closer to breakdown. The disagreement about which word is more accurate has never fully settled, and I'd trust anyone who tells you it obviously has one answer far less than someone honest enough to say it's still argued. What Jung actually did, starting in December 1913, was develop a specific procedure, applied with what can only be called scientific discipline given the material involved. He would deliberately evoke a waking fantasy, not simply daydream passively, but actively call up an image and then enter it, the way you might step into a scene rather than watch it from outside, participating in whatever unfolded rather than directing it toward an outcome he had already decided. He described his own motivation in almost clinical terms. He wanted to see what happened when he, in his words, switched off ordinary consciousness and let whatever was underneath surface on its own terms. treating it the way a scientist treats an experiment whose result isn't known in advance. He recorded these episodes first in a set of working journals that came to be called the Black Books, then later reworked the material with extensive added commentary and interpretation into the manuscript that became the Red Book. This was not automatic writing in the spiritualist sense popular at the time, and it wasn't meditation in the sense either Eastern or Western traditions typically describe it. It was something closer to a disciplined, repeatable act of imaginative confrontation, undertaken by a man who kept one foot very deliberately planted in ordinary waking judgment the entire time. A detail that turns out to be the single most important design feature of the whole method, and one we'll come back to directly when we build the technique itself. The figures that emerged were not vague symbolic abstractions. They had names, personalities, and, crucially for what Jung eventually built out of this experience, they disagreed with him. Philemon, the winged old man, is the most famous, and Jung was explicit that Philemon said things Jung did not consciously believe and would not have consciously constructed, teaching him, among other things, that the images and ideas arising in the psyche possessed a kind of independent life of their own, not reducible to whatever the dreamer or visionary happened to already think. Other figures followed, a young woman he called Salome, a serpent, a wise-seeming inner figure named Elijah, and arriving with far more menace than the others, the material that would eventually crystallize, in 1916, into the 7 sermons and the figure of Abraxas. The sermons themselves arrived under strange circumstances even by the standards of everything else in this period. Jung later described his house filling, over several days, with a sense of dense, oppressive presence, footsteps, a strange restlessness in the household, his children reporting disturbed sleep and odd sensations, the family doorbell reportedly ringing with no one visible outside. Whatever the objective cause of these events, and reasonable people can and do read this as anything from a genuine paranormal cluster to heightened suggestibility in a household under serious psychological strain from the father's ongoing crisis. Jung's own account is that the disturbance resolved only once he sat down and over 3 consecutive evenings wrote out what became the 7 sermons virtually without pause. Experiencing the process less like composition and more like transcription of something arriving from outside his own deliberate control, he chose to attribute the resulting text to Basilides rather than sign his own name to it, a decision scholars have read multiple ways, as a scholarly nod to the genuine historical roots of the ideas as a psychologically protective distancing device, or as Jung's own intuition that the material genuinely belonged to a tradition older and larger than his individual authorship. Inside the text, the figure who calls himself Basilides describes a reality structured around a fundamental opposition. On one side, the pleroma, an undifferentiated fullness containing all possible opposites in perfect, meaningless balance. On the other, the created world, called creatura, defined precisely by the fact that it distinguishes things from one another, light from dark, good from evil, self from other. Standing between these two, neither fully one nor the other, is Abraxas, a force the text describes as generating both truth and deception, both life and death, in the same act, more powerful and more feared than either the god of light or the devil of darkness, because it is neither and both, indifferent to the human need to sort experience into safe categories. If you know the actual history of Gnosticism even a little, you'll recognize immediately what Jung had reconstructed. Abraxas is a real name from the real historical record, associated, in the surviving fragments of Basilides' actual teaching, as reported by hostile early Christian writers like Irenaeus and Hippolytus, with a ruling power positioned between the unknowable true God and the flawed material world, structurally very close to what other Gnostic schools of the same period called the Demiurge, a lesser, partial creator power, responsible for the visible cosmos but categorically inferior to whatever lies beyond it. Jung, writing in Zurich in 1916, working from what he insisted was direct inner experience rather than prior scholarly reading, had arrived at a cosmological structure that maps with genuine precision onto a 2,000-year-old heresy he had not, at that point, studied in serious depth. This is the fact later Jungian scholars, writers like Stefan Heuler, whose extended commentary on the sermons is where the phrase Jung's Gnostic Demiurge comes from directly in the secondary literature, have spent decades trying to account for. Was Jung, consciously or not, drawing on scattered fragments of Gnostic material he'd absorbed somewhere and forgotten? Was he demonstrating, by pure accident of convergence, that the human unconscious tends to generate broadly similar cosmological structures across wildly different eras when pushed into the same kind of extremity? Or was something else going on that neither psychology nor history has good language for? Jung's own later theoretical answer to this question became the concept of the collective unconscious, the idea that certain patterns, which he called archetypes, are not learned individually, but are a shared, inherited structure of the human mind itself, which is why a psychiatrist in early 20th century Zurich and a religious teacher in 2nd century Alexandria could independently generate structurally similar cosmologies without either one copying the other. That's a genuinely serious scientific hypothesis, still debated, still influential, and still short of anything like foolproof, and I think you deserve to know that distinction clearly, rather than have it flattened into he-channeled ancient truth, which is a much smaller and less interesting claim than what actually happened. There is one more piece of this history that almost no one mentions, and it's the detail that made Jung's own private material feel, to him personally, less like fantasy and more like genuine contact with something real. In 1952, a Coptic manuscript surfaced on the antiquities market in Cairo, part of a larger cache of ancient texts discovered 7 years earlier in 1945. Near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi, by a farmer digging for fertilizer and stumbling instead on a sealed jar containing 13 leather-bound books of genuine, previously unknown Gnostic scripture. Most of that trove ended up appropriately in the Coptic Museum in Cairo. One single codex, however, was purchased separately through the mediation of a Dutch scholar named Gilles Quispel, and brought specifically to the Jung Institute in Zurich, where it was presented to Jung as a birthday gift. It is still known today in the scholarly literature as the Jung Codex, Codex Fun of the Nag Hammadi Library, containing, among other material, a text called the Gospel of Truth, widely attributed to Valentinus, another major figure of 2nd century Gnostic Christianity. For the first time in Jung's life, he was holding genuine primary Gnostic scripture, not second-hand summaries filtered through hostile early Christian critics, but the actual words of the tradition itself, recovered from the desert 19 centuries after burial. He was 77 years old. He had been writing about a Gnostic structured cosmology under a dead Gnostic teacher's borrowed name. For 36 years by that point, based on nothing but his own visionary material. Now the actual texts were in front of him, and by every account from people close to him at the time, the resonance he found between his own private material and the newly surfaced ancient scripture struck him as a form of vindication he had waited decades to receive. I want to pause here and correct the misconception that usually rides in on the back of a story like this one. because it's the exact place where honest history gets replaced with manipulative framing. The misconception is that Jung was secretly a channeler, or medium in the popular occult sense, that he believed himself literally possessed by ancient spirits, or that the Red Book is best understood as a grimoire, a magical text meant to be used ritually to summon entities. That is not the framework Jung himself used, publicly or, as far as the full documentation shows, privately either. Jung's consistent professional position, developed and refined across the rest of his career, was that active imagination is a psychological method, not a supernatural one, a disciplined technique for allowing unconscious psychic material to take on enough autonomous form that it can be engaged, questioned, and integrated by the conscious mind, without requiring any metaphysical claim about spirits, demons, or literal external entities to make sense of what's happening, or to make the technique useful. He was explicit in his later theoretical writing that the value of the method does not depend on resolving the metaphysical question of what these figures ultimately are. It depends on treating them, functionally, as psychologically real and worth taking seriously, a distinction that matters enormously and that I'll ask you to hold on to for the rest of this video, because the practical technique we're about to build works whether you personally believe Philemon was a literal spirit, a personification of unconscious wisdom, or simply a useful fiction your own mind constructed to organize material it couldn't yet articulate directly. The second misconception is nearly the opposite one, that this was all, in the end, just ordinary daydreaming with an impressive vocabulary attached. Nothing a person couldn't do idly on a commute. Jung himself pushed back against this reading directly and often, and the distinction he drew is the one that actually makes the technique work, rather than just feel evocative. Ordinary fantasy, in his framework, is passive. You watch it happen, you don't participate, and critically, your conscious values and judgments stay disengaged the entire time. Which is exactly why daydreaming rarely produces lasting psychological change, no matter how vivid it gets. Active imagination requires something structurally different. Full participation as a character inside the unfolding scene, combined with the simultaneous retention of ordinary ego-level judgment, so that you can actually argue with, question, or set boundaries with what appears, rather than simply observing it float by. That combination, vivid, unforced imaginal content plus retained critical presence, is difficult to sustain, takes practice to do reliably, and is precisely the thing that separates productive inner work from the kind of unbounded psychic flooding Jung feared most for himself, and later warned his own students about directly. The third misconception, and one that matters directly for how you should approach this yourself, is the romantic image of Jung as a lone genius, wrestling with his visions in total isolation, answerable to no one. The documented reality is considerably more grounded and considerably more instructive. Jung's wife, Emma Jung, herself later became a serious analyst in her own right and was aware of and involved in this period of his life in real practical ways, managing a household of 5 children through years in which her husband was, by his own account, engaged in genuinely destabilizing work. Tony Wolff, who began as a patient and became both a close collaborator and, for decades, a significant figure in Jung's professional and personal life, is widely credited by historians of this period with providing crucial support and, in some accounts, active participation in aspects of Jung's self-exploration during exactly these years. Jung also maintained ongoing professional contact with colleagues throughout this period, even while working through the most intense material privately. The lesson buried in this correction is a practical one. not just a historical footnote. Even the founder of this method, doing the deepest, most dangerous version of it that anyone has ever documented, was not doing it in a vacuum. He had people around him who knew, at least in general terms, what he was going through. If you take up any serious version of this practice yourself, the historically accurate model to follow is not solitary isolation, but exactly the opposite. Doing the work with at least one other person aware of your process, even if that person isn't formally trained, simply so that you are never the only living witness to your own inner state during a period of genuinely deep work. Which brings us to the last piece of foundational history. Why, if this technique is genuinely useful and genuinely well documented, most people outside specialized Jungian training have never been taught how to actually do it. Part of the answer is Jung's own ambivalence, which we've already covered. The decades of concealment weren't an accident of circumstance. They were a decision. Made first by Jung and then extended by his family, driven by real professional risk in a field that spent much of the 20th century trying to establish itself as a legitimate medical science, and had every incentive to distance itself from anything that looked like Jung had been personally unwell. But there's a second, less personal reason, worth naming honestly. The broader field of psychology, for most of the mid-20th century, moved in a direction that had very little room for this kind of work at all. Behaviorism dominated academic psychology for decades, treating internal mental content as largely irrelevant or unmeasurable, and therefore unworthy of serious study. When cognitive psychology displaced behaviorism later in the century, it brought a renewed interest in internal mental representations, but largely within an information processing framework that had little natural vocabulary for something like a sustained imaginal dialogue with an autonomous inner figure. Depth psychology in general, and Jungian analytic training specifically, kept the technique alive, but largely within a narrow professional guild, training analysts, certification programs, a relatively small and specialized literature, rather than in the kind of broadly accessible form that, say, meditation or cognitive behavioral techniques eventually achieved. It took writers like Robert Johnson, working specifically to translate the method into plain, teachable language for a general audience starting in the 1980s, to pull active imagination out of the specialist literature and into something an ordinary, curious person could actually pick up and try, which is exactly the version we're going to build together now. The 2009 publication of the Red Book changed this picture more than any single event since Johnson's book, and it's worth understanding exactly how. Before 2009, most people practicing active imagination, including many trained analysts, were working from Jung's later, heavily theorized descriptions of the method in his published collected works, accounts written retrospectively. Decades after the fact, in careful, somewhat clinical language designed for a scientific audience he was trying to persuade of his method's legitimacy. What the Red Book's publication revealed, for the first time, was the raw material those later theoretical descriptions had been built on top of, and in significant ways, sanitized in the retelling. Reading the actual unfiltered visionary content directly, the genuine strangeness, the genuine emotional intensity, the genuine uncertainty Jung himself carried through the process in real time, gave a fuller, considerably less tidy picture of what the technique had actually involved at its origin than the polished later theory had suggested. Several contemporary Jungian writers describe this as a meaningful shift in how the technique is now taught. Less as a clean, clinical procedure guaranteed to produce orderly insight, and more honestly as what it actually was for its originator, a genuinely difficult, sometimes frightening confrontation that happened to be survivable and useful. precisely because of the disciplined structure wrapped around it, not because the structure removed the difficulty entirely. Let's build the technique itself in enough concrete detail that you could make a first careful attempt tonight. The method has 4 stages, following the structure Robert Johnson laid out in his 1986 book Inner Work, which remains the clearest widely available translation of Jung's original, much less systematized process into something a beginner can actually follow. The 4 stages are invitation, dialogue, adding the ethical element, and physical ritual. I'll walk through each one in detail, and I'll flag as we go the specific places where this technique can go wrong if rushed. Because that caution is not an afterthought here, it's baked into the structure of the method itself, by design, because the man who developed it was managing real personal risk the entire time he was doing it. Stage 1 is invitation. Sit or lie somewhere quiet, undisturbed, with no screens nearby, and give yourself a genuinely open block of time, 20 minutes at minimum for a first attempt, so you're not rushing the process to fit a schedule. The starting point is almost always an image already knocking at the door of your attention, a figure or scene from a recent dream you haven't fully understood, a strong, otherwise inexplicable emotional reaction to something small during your day, a recurring image or phrase that keeps surfacing uninvited. Close your eyes, bring that image or figure to mind as clearly as you can, and then, this is the actual technical move, wait. Don't direct what happens next. Don't decide in advance what the figure will say or do. The entire discipline of this first stage is quieting your own habitual, controlling narration long enough for something to arise on its own terms rather than on your terms. This is often the hardest part for people used to structured thinking, and it's completely normal for the first several attempts to produce very little. A static image that doesn't move, a vague sense of presence without content. That's not failure. Jung's own early attempts, by his own account, took real sustained effort before anything moved on its own. Stage 2 is dialogue, and it's the heart of the method. Once an image begins to develop any independent motion, the figure moves, speaks, changes, or simply becomes more vivid and specific, you enter it as a participant rather than an observer. Speak to it, internally or, especially for beginners, out loud or in writing, and then, crucially, let it answer. This is the step people find hardest to trust, because it requires you to write or speak a response that doesn't feel like it's coming from your ordinary deliberate thinking, a response that surprises you even as you produce it. Johnson and other Jungian writers are consistent on this point. It is extraordinarily difficult, in practice, to produce a dialogue response that isn't drawing on some real, if previously unconscious, material inside you, precisely because you cannot invent something from truly nothing. Everything that surfaces has to be built from psychic material that was already there, simply not yet organized into conscious awareness. Ask the figure direct questions. What do you want? Why are you here? What do you know that I don't? Write down both sides of the exchange as it happens, in real time if possible, because the temptation to smooth and edit the dialogue after the fact, making the unconscious figure sound more coherent or more agreeable than it actually was in the moment, is strong and defeats much of the purpose. Stage 3 is the one Jung considered most essential, and that inexperienced practitioners most often skip entirely, and it's specifically the safeguard built directly out of his own fear of losing himself in this material, adding the ethical element. Whatever the figure says, however compelling, wise, or seductive it seems, you are required to respond to it with your own actual conscious values. Genuinely disagreeing when something in the dialogue conflicts with what you consciously believe is right, pushing back against demands or claims that don't sit well with your waking judgment, rather than simply accepting whatever the unconscious material offers as automatically true or automatically wise. This is not a minor procedural footnote. Jung was explicit, later in his career, that failing to bring real ethical judgment into the dialogue was the single most dangerous way to misuse this technique. It's the difference between a structured, bounded engagement with unconscious material and simply handing your judgment over to whatever surfaces, uncritically, which is a meaningfully different and much riskier activity. If a figure in your dialogue asks you to do something that concerns you, argue with it. If it makes a claim about you or the world that doesn't feel true, say so inside the dialogue and see how it responds. This retained critical friction is what keeps active imagination a psychological technique rather than something closer to simple suggestion or self-hypnosis. Stage 4 is physical ritual, and it exists to close the process properly rather than leaving it suspended in an ambiguous space between the imaginal and the ordinary. Once the dialogue reaches some kind of natural conclusion, not necessarily full resolution, simply a sense that this particular session has run its course. Do something small and physical that concretizes whatever you took from the exchange. This does not mean literally acting out anything the figure suggested. Johnson is specific that incarnating the imagination means distilling the insight or feeling from the encounter and giving it a modest, symbolic, real-world expression, not obeying it literally. If the dialogue surfaced something about a neglected part of your life, the ritual might be as simple as writing a single sentence of commitment and setting a specific time this week to act on it. If it surfaced grief you hadn't consciously acknowledged, the ritual might be lighting a candle, or setting aside 10 minutes to sit with that feeling deliberately, rather than pushing it away. The physical action, however small, is what pulls the material back across the threshold into ordinary waking life, preventing the entire experience from staying sealed off in a separate, disconnected imaginal compartment, where it can neither be integrated nor, frankly, properly monitored by your everyday judgment. It helps to see what a real modest session actually looks like on the page, since the 4 stages can sound more abstract than they feel in practice. Imagine someone who keeps dreaming, without explanation, of a locked door in a hallway of their childhood home. In stage 1, they bring the image of that door to mind, quiet their planning mind, and wait until, instead of staying static, the door develops a small brass handle they hadn't noticed before, and a faint sound behind it. In stage 2 they write, addressing the door directly, "Why are you locked?" And instead of writing what they expected, some tidy line about hidden fear, they find themselves writing, in the door's voice, that it isn't locked at all, that it has simply never been asked to open, because everyone who passed it in the dream always assumed it was sealed and walked by. That small surprise, the door correcting an assumption the dreamer didn't know they were making, is exactly the kind of modest, undramatic, but genuinely autonomous feeling response the technique is built to produce. In stage 3, the dreamer might push back, asking why, if it was never locked, it always felt so foreboding, and let the door answer that in its own terms, rather than accepting the first answer as final. In stage 4, the physical ritual might be as small as literally opening a closet door in their actual house that they've been avoiding cleaning out for a year, translating the imaginal insight into one concrete, minor, real-world action. Nothing about this example involves cosmic revelation or archetypal grandeur. That's deliberate. The overwhelming majority of real active imagination sessions for the overwhelming majority of people who practice it look much closer to this than to the Red Book, and that's exactly as it should be. Jung's own material was unusual in intensity precisely because of the unusual crisis he was in when he produced it, not because intensity is the standard the technique is measured against. Try a compressed, careful version of Stage 1 and Stage 2 right now if you're curious, even sitting where you are, eyes open if that feels safer for a first attempt. Bring to mind one recent dream image or one recurring emotional reaction you haven't examined, and simply ask it, in writing, one question: what do you want me to know? And let yourself write an answer without planning it first. Don't go further than that on a first try. We'll build up to sustain sessions properly across the next several sections. Let's talk about how this scales across different levels of experience, because someone attempting this for the first time tonight, and someone who has practiced it for years, the way Jung himself eventually did, are doing recognisably different things even though the underlying structure is the same. At the beginner level, the entire goal for your first several weeks is simply becoming comfortable with stages 1 and 2, learning to let an image move on its own, and learning to write dialogue that surprises you rather than dialogue you've pre-planned. Keep sessions short, 20 to 30 minutes, always in writing rather than purely internal at this stage, because the physical act of writing slows the process down enough to catch yourself if you start unconsciously steering the dialogue toward what you expect or want to hear. Don't worry at all about Stage 3's ethical friction at first, if it isn't arising naturally. Some early dialogues are simple enough, dealing with low-stakes material, that no real ethical tension appears, and that's fine. The goal at this level is purely building the basic reflex, image, participation, response, all while staying anchored enough in ordinary awareness that you can stop at any point and simply open your eyes and be back in the room. At the intermediate level, usually once the basic reflex is comfortable, you begin working more deliberately with recurring figures rather than one-off images, noticing that a particular character or presence returns across multiple separate sessions, sometimes over weeks or months, developing what starts to feel like a genuine, continuing relationship with a specific part of your own inner landscape. This is also the level at which Stage 3, the ethical element, becomes essential rather than optional, because recurring figures tend to develop more specific, sometimes more demanding personalities, and the discipline of maintaining your own conscious judgment against a figure that has become psychologically compelling through repeated contact is precisely the skill this whole method exists. To build. Some intermediate practitioners begin supplementing written dialogue with a second expressive channel, simple drawing or painting of the figures involved, which is exactly what Jung himself did extensively throughout the Red Book period, using image alongside text specifically because some psychic material resists translation into words alone and finds a more accurate form in colour and shape. At the advanced level, and I want to be direct that this is a small minority of practitioners, almost always working alongside a trained analyst rather than in full isolation, precisely because of the risks involved, active imagination becomes a sustained, long-term practice, engaging deeply with the largest, most archetypally loaded material, death, meaning. The structure of one's whole life narrative, the kind of material Jung himself was engaging when Philemon and Abraxas emerged. Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's closest collaborator, and one of the most important Jungian analysts of the 20th century in her own right, extended active imagination specifically into alchemical material later in her career, using the symbolic language of medieval alchemy as a structured container for exactly this kind of deep sustained imaginal work, on the theory that alchemical imagery, transformation, dissolution, recombination, provided an unusually well-developed traditional vocabulary for psychological processes that otherwise resist articulation. This level of practice is not something I'd recommend attempting without either professional support or, at minimum, an experienced companion who can serve as an outside reality check, a role Jung himself, by his own admission, lacked during his most dangerous early years, and one he later insisted his own students secure for themselves before going deep into this kind of work. It's worth addressing directly how this adapts if visual imagination isn't your natural mode, because a meaningful number of people simply do not experience strong mental imagery, a real, only recently well-studied condition called aphantasia, where voluntary visual imagination is faint or entirely absent, even though the rest of cognition functions completely normally. Active imagination does not require vivid visual pictures to work. Jung's own students developed variants suited to different natural modes of inner experience. If your inner world is more verbal than visual, the dialogue can proceed as an entirely written or internally spoken conversation. With no visual component required at all, many practitioners report this actually sharpens the ethical, argumentative quality of stage 3, since language forces more explicit articulation than a passing image does. If your natural mode is more kinesthetic and body-based, a related tradition called authentic movement, developed by the dance therapist Mary Starks Whitehouse, working directly from Jungian principles, uses physical movement itself as the medium of active imagination, letting the body move spontaneously without choreographed intention, while an outside witness observes, translating the same core structure of invitation, participation, and reflection into movement rather than words or images. And a separate but closely related method, sand play therapy, developed by the Jungian analyst Dora Kalf, uses miniature figures arranged freely in a tray of sand as the medium, useful particularly for people, including children, for whom direct verbal or visual dialogue feels too exposed or too abstract to access easily. It's also worth knowing that this practice, despite being fundamentally private and internal, has a real tradition of structured group support built around it, which is a useful adaptation for anyone hesitant to work through this entirely alone, but without access to a trained analyst. Jungian training institutes commonly run what are generally called dream and image groups, small ongoing peer circles, sometimes facilitated by a senior analyst, and sometimes simply organised among trained peers, where participants bring material from their own dream work or active imagination sessions to be witnessed and discussed, without the group attempting to interpret or direct another member's material, only to hold space for it and offer the kind of outside perspective a purely solo practitioner lacks. Several contemporary practitioners outside formal analytic training have adapted this same basic structure informally, 2 or 3 people meeting regularly, each doing their own private practice between sessions, then coming together simply to describe, not interpret, what arose, treating the group itself as a form of stage 4 grounding, translating private imaginal material into a small, trusted, spoken social act. If the idea of doing any version of this work entirely alone feels daunting, building even a 2-person version of this structure before your first session is a reasonable and historically well-precedented way to lower the real risks described earlier while still getting the genuine value of the practice itself. Now let's turn to why any of this actually works, because I promised evidence over vibes at the start of this video, and there's real, substantial modern research worth walking through carefully, most of it developed entirely independently of Jung, by researchers who in many cases never cite him at all, which is itself a meaningful form of evidence. since convergent discovery from unconnected directions tends to be more trustworthy than a single tradition insisting on its own validity. The clearest and closest modern parallel is internal family systems, a psychotherapy model developed by the family therapist Richard Schwartz starting in the 1980s, built on the observation, arrived at through ordinary clinical practice rather than any deliberate Jungian influence, that the mind is usefully understood not as a single unified voice, but as a collection of distinct internal parts, each with its own perspective, history, and motivation, which can be engaged in direct, structured internal dialogue, noticing a part, getting curious about it, rather than immediately trying to fix or suppress it, and letting it speak for itself. The structural resemblance to active imagination's invitation and dialogue stages is close enough that several contemporary Jungian writers now explicitly cross-reference IF's language when teaching active imagination to newer audiences. Precisely because Schwartz's model gives the same underlying process a secular, clinically validated vocabulary, with a genuine outcome research literature behind it, including randomized trials showing meaningful symptom improvement for conditions including depression and post-traumatic stress. A second, older parallel comes from Gestalt therapy, developed by Fritz Perls starting in the 1940s and 50s, whose empty chair technique, placing an imagined figure or an imagined disowned part of the self in an empty chair and speaking to it directly, then physically switching seats to answer as that figure, shares an almost identical structural logic to active imagination's dialogue stage, translated into physical staging rather than internal visualization. Perls developed this independently of Jung, working from a different theoretical lineage rooted in phenomenology and existential psychology, which again strengthens the case that something real and repeatable is being captured here rather than one idiosyncratic tradition's private mythology. A third parallel, with a genuinely strong outcome research base behind it, comes from the psychologist James Pennebaker's research on expressive writing, beginning in the 1980s at the University of Texas, which found, across dozens of subsequent replications, that structured writing about emotionally significant material, writing that gives unstructured, often previously unacknowledged psychological content and organized external form, produces measurable improvements in both psychological and, in some studies, physical health markers. Pennebaker's model doesn't involve dialogue with autonomous figures the way active imagination does, but it shares the same underlying mechanism active imagination stage 2 relies on, giving unconscious or half-formed material an external articulated form is not neutral. The act of articulation itself appears to change how that material is processed and held, a finding with real experimental support rather than purely theoretical plausibility. A fourth parallel comes from narrative therapy, developed by the family therapist Michael White beginning in the 1980s in Australia, built around a technique called externalization, treating a problem not as an inherent, fixed part of a person's identity, but as a separate, semi-autonomous presence that can be named, described, and even spoken with directly, distinct from the person experiencing it. White worked from a background in family systems theory and postmodern philosophy, with essentially no direct Jungian influence, yet arrived at a method that shares the same core move active imagination makes with its own figures, treating something normally experienced as an inseparable part of oneself as a distinct presence one can address, question, and negotiate with, rather than simply be identical to. The fact that 4 separate clinical traditions, Schwartz's internal parts, Perls's empty chair, Pennebaker's externalized writing, and White's externalized problems independently converged on structurally similar techniques, working from entirely different theoretical starting points across nearly a century of psychotherapy's development. Is itself a form of evidence worth taking seriously? Whatever is actually happening when unconscious or disowned material gets addressed as a separate dialogical presence, it appears to be tapping into something real and repeatable about how human minds process difficult internal content, rather than being one idiosyncratic tradition's private article of faith. On the neuroscience side, I want to be honest about the limits of what's actually been studied, because this is exactly the place online content usually overclaims. There is no substantial body of neuroimaging research specifically on active imagination as Jung defined it. It's too specialized and too methodologically difficult to practice to have attracted the kind of large-scale funded research that meditation, for instance, has received over the past 3 decades. What we do have is a broader, reasonably well-supported literature on the neuroscience of imagination and self-generated mental content more generally, including research on the default mode network, the set of interconnected brain regions active during internally directed thought, autobiographical memory, and imaginative simulation, as opposed to externally focused attention. Some researchers studying this network have proposed that structured engagement with self-generated imaginal content, of the kind active imagination and its modern relatives all involve, may work partly by giving normally diffuse, unintegrated activity in this network a more organized, narrativized structure. Though I want to flag clearly that this remains a plausible, actively researched hypothesis rather than a settled finding, and I'd be doing you a disservice to present it with more confidence than the field itself currently has. The place where science genuinely stops and Jung's own deeper claim begins is the metaphysical question he never fully resolved for himself: whether figures like Philemon possess some form of independent psychic reality beyond being organized clusters of the dreamer's own unconscious material, or whether independent is simply the most accurate word available for how thoroughly compartmentalized and genuinely autonomous certain unconscious contents can feel from the inside, without requiring any claim beyond ordinary, if unusually deep, psychology. I'm not going to tell you which reading is correct, because I don't think anyone honestly can yet, including the historians and analysts who have spent entire careers on this exact question. What I can tell you, and what I think is actually the more useful takeaway, is that the practical technique works, produces measurable, reportable psychological change under either interpretation, the same way the breathing technique in an entirely different kind of contemplative practice works, whether or not you believe a particular metaphysical framework built around it. You don't have to resolve Jung's hardest unanswered question to get real value from the method he built while trying to answer it. Let's talk directly about what goes wrong, because this is the section Jung himself would have insisted on including, given how seriously he took the risks in his own case, and it's the section most content built around this topic skips entirely in favour of manufactured excitement. The first and most important danger has a specific name in Jungian theory: psychic inflation. This is what happens when a person doing this kind of work begins to identify too completely with an archetypal figure or piece of unconscious material, losing the critical distance that stage 3 of the technique, the ethical element, exists specifically to maintain. Practically, this looks like someone who begins genuinely believing they have unique, privileged access to cosmic truth unavailable to other people, or who starts making major life decisions based uncritically on what a figure in active imagination told them, without subjecting that content to the same ordinary scrutiny they'd apply to advice from any other source. Jung watched this happen to some of his own early followers, and warned about it explicitly and repeatedly in his later writings specifically, because he recognized the pull toward it in his own experience during the Red Book years. If you notice yourself feeling specially chosen, uniquely awakened or meaningfully superior to people who haven't done this kind of work. That feeling is itself the warning sign the technique's own designer built the ethical stage to catch, not evidence you're doing it particularly well. The second danger, closely related, is losing the anchor back to ordinary consciousness. Sessions that don't end cleanly, imaginal material that starts intruding uninvited outside of deliberate practice sessions, or a general sense that the boundary between the imaginal work and ordinary daily reality is thinning in a way that feels disorienting rather than integrative. This is precisely why Stage 4, physical ritual, is not an optional flourish. It's the structural mechanism for closing each session properly, and skipping it repeatedly is one of the more common ways beginners run into trouble. Jung had a specific term for the structure that's supposed to prevent this second danger, borrowed from ancient Greek religious architecture, temenos, originally referring to a physically bounded sacred precinct, a piece of ground marked off and set apart from ordinary use around a temple. He used the word psychologically to describe the deliberately bounded space, in time, in attention. In ritual framing, that makes intense inner work safe to enter precisely because its edges are clear, rather than blurred into the whole of ordinary life. Practically, this means every element of the four-stage technique described earlier is doing double duty. It's not just a method for producing rich material, it's simultaneously the construction of a temenos around that material, with a defined beginning, defined boundaries of participation and critical judgment, and a defined deliberate ending. Practitioners who report the fewest difficulties over long-term practice are, without much exception, the ones who treat this boundary setting as seriously as the content of the dialogue itself, starting sessions at a consistent, chosen time rather than whenever a figure happens to intrude, and closing them definitively with Stage 4's ritual, rather than letting a session trail off unresolved because the material felt too interesting to formally end. If you find yourself wanting to skip the ending because a dialogue feels unfinished, that impulse is worth noticing directly. The temenos exists precisely for the sessions that feel most compelling to leave open, not only for the easy ones. The third and most serious distinction, and the one Jung cared about with the most personal urgency given his own history, is the difference between productive active imagination and a genuine psychotic process, and it's worth being specific and honest about the clinical markers rather than vague about them. In active imagination, as properly practiced, the ego retains awareness throughout that it is engaged in a deliberate, contained, voluntary process, one that can be started and stopped at will, with clear boundaries in time and space. In psychosis, by clinical contrast, that boundary and that voluntary control are precisely what's compromised. The experience is not something the person enters and exits deliberately. It does not stay contained to a chosen time and place. And critically, the person's ordinary reality testing about the difference between the imaginal and the actual becomes impaired rather than staying intact. If active imagination practice ever begins to feel involuntary, images or figures intruding outside of sessions you've chosen to begin, a felt loss of the ability to distinguish the imaginal material from ordinary waking reality, or a growing inability to stop the process once started, that is not a sign of unusual spiritual depth or special sensitivity. It is a clear, specific signal to stop the practice entirely and speak with a mental health professional promptly, ideally one with training in depth psychology, who will take the content seriously rather than dismissing it, but who can also assess, with clinical tools neither you nor I have access to from a video, whether what's happening has crossed from disciplined imaginative work into something that needs a different kind of care. this is not a hedge added to cover myself. It is the exact caution Jung applied to his own case, seeking regular contact with trusted colleagues during his most intense years, specifically as an external check he couldn't provide for himself. And it's a caution every serious Jungian training program still builds explicitly into how active imagination is taught today, generally restricting unsupervised deep practice to people who have first done substantial preparatory work with a trained analyst. It's worth knowing how the professional training world actually handles this risk, because it's more structured than most popular accounts suggest. Candidates training to become certified Jungian analysts through institutes like the CG, Jung Institute in Zurich or its counterparts elsewhere, are required to undergo extensive personal analysis themselves before they are permitted to guide others through this kind of work, precisely so that an experienced outside professional has had the opportunity to observe how a given individual handles sustained contact with unconscious material before that person is trusted to lead someone else through it. Training programs generally treat readiness for deep, unsupervised active imagination as something to be assessed individually rather than assumed by default. People with a personal or family history of psychotic disorders, or people going through acute crisis in their ordinary waking life, are typically advised toward more contained, supported forms of the work, or away from it entirely for the time being, rather than toward the deepest, most unsupervised version of the practice. None of this is meant to frighten you away from the beginner-level practice described earlier in this video, which carries genuinely modest risk for most people attempting it thoughtfully, in short sessions, with the safeguards already built in. It's meant to give you an honest sense of why the professional field around this technique looks the way it does, rather than leaving you to assume, incorrectly, that either nobody takes the risk seriously, or that the risk is so severe nobody should touch the technique at all. Both extremes are wrong, and the truth sits, as it usually does, in the more careful middle, a real technique, with a real history of real people using it safely and well, alongside a real minority of cases where it went badly, and a real professional infrastructure built specifically to reduce that minority further. It's worth knowing too what Jung did for himself, outside the imaginal work entirely, to stay grounded during these years, because it wasn't only journaling and dialogue. Starting in 1923, he began building, largely with his own hands, a stone tower at Bollingen on the shore of Lake Zurich. Physical, repetitive, unglamorous manual labour, expanded over decades into a small personal retreat where he split his time between the demanding inner work of active imagination and the entirely different, deliberately concrete discipline of stonework, gardening, and simple domestic routine. He was explicit, later in life, that this physical grounding was not incidental to the psychological work, but essential to it, a direct bodily counterweight to the extraordinary interior material he was engaging, and worth taking seriously as part of the actual technique, rather than a charming biographical footnote. If you take up any version of this practice yourself, build in your own version of the tower, something ordinary, physical and repetitive that has nothing to do with symbols or dialogue at all, practiced alongside the inner work rather than instead of it. With the technique, its real history, its mechanisms, and its genuine risks laid out honestly, let's talk about what sustained practice actually looks like over weeks, months, and years. Because a technique described once and a technique lived with are very different things, and this is where the abstract becomes usable. I want to start with real figures from the historical record rather than only composite modern accounts, because Jung was not alone in taking this practice seriously across a working lifetime. and it's worth knowing the range of what serious, sustained engagement with this method has actually looked like. Marie-Louise von Franz, who worked alongside Jung for decades and became one of the most respected analysts in her own right, extended active imagination into sustained engagement with fairy tales and alchemical texts, treating traditional symbolic material as a kind of pre-built container for exactly the psychological processes active imagination surfaces directly, and wrote extensively across a long career about how this deepened rather than diminished with decades of practice. James Hillman, who trained originally within the Jungian tradition before founding what he called archetypal psychology, took a more radically image-centered approach, arguing across his career that the images themselves, treated with full seriousness on their own terms, rather than immediately translated into abstract psychological concepts, were where the real therapeutic and philosophical value of this kind of work actually lived, a genuinely different emphasis from Jung's own more integrative approach, and evidence that serious engagement with this method has never required uncritical agreement with every detail of how Jung himself framed it. Alongside those named historical figures, I want to share a few composite patterns drawn from how modern practitioners, people working with contemporary Jungian analysts, or using accessible guides like Johnson's book independently, describe their experience over time, presented as illustrative composites rather than any single verified individual story. Both because that's the more honest way to represent a range of common experience, and because it protects the privacy of the actual clinical and personal accounts these patterns are drawn from. One common pattern: someone beginning with a recurring, unsettling dream figure they'd previously just tried to ignore, finding that the first several active imagination sessions produced very little beyond simple, almost mundane dialogue, and only around the 6th or 7th session encountering a genuine surprise. A response from the figure that clearly wasn't something they'd have consciously constructed, carrying real emotional weight, often connected to a life circumstance the person hadn't consciously linked to the original dream image at all. Another common pattern, particularly among people using the written, journal-based version of the practice, a period of several weeks where the dialogue felt flat and effortful, followed by what practitioners often describe as the dialogue starting to write itself. Sessions where the responses arrive faster than deliberate thought would allow, a shift that reliably marks, across many independent accounts, the transition from simulated to genuinely active imagination in Jung's original technical sense. A third pattern, worth naming honestly because it complicates any simple narrative of steady progress, practitioners who found early sessions vivid and rewarding, then hit a period, often months in, of genuine difficulty, material surfacing that felt destabilizing, grief or anger they hadn't expected. A period where the work required real professional support to continue safely rather than being manageable alone. This is not a failure of the technique, it's precisely the kind of material Jung himself encountered, and precisely why the method was never designed, by the people who actually developed and taught it professionally, to be undertaken indefinitely without any outside support once the material gets genuinely deep. A fourth pattern, more common among people who came to this practice already carrying an existing therapy or analysis relationship, involved active imagination sessions serving less as a stand-alone practice and more as raw material brought back into conversation with a therapist, writing a dialogue independently during the week. Then discussing what emerged with a trained third party who could offer perspective the practitioner couldn't access alone, precisely the collaborative structure Jung's own successors built the professional training model around. People describing this pattern consistently report it feels different, and generally safer and more productive than either purely solo practice or purely conventional talk therapy alone, combining the depth of direct imaginal contact with the outside reality check a good therapist provides. A fifth pattern, reported specifically by people with a strong existing creative practice, visual artists, writers, musicians, involved recognizing, sometimes with real surprise, that they had already been doing an unstructured, informal version of active imagination for years through their creative work, without having a name for it or the ethical friction safeguard of stage 3 built in deliberately. For several of these practitioners, formalizing the practice with Jung's actual structure, particularly adding the previously missing ethical dialogue stage, changed the character of work they'd already been doing informally for a long time, giving it a containment and a directness it had lacked when treated purely as artistic inspiration rather than disciplined inner dialogue. Here is a structure for a first sustained 30-day engagement if you want to test this properly rather than judging it off one session. Days 1 through 7, practice only stages 1 and 2, invitation and dialogue, in writing, using whatever recent dream image or recurring emotional reaction naturally presents itself each day. Keep sessions to 20 or 30 minutes. Don't force stage 3's ethical friction if it isn't arising naturally yet, and don't attempt stage 4's physical ritual with any real weight this week. The goal is purely building comfort with letting written dialogue surprise you. Days 8 through 14, begin deliberately incorporating stage 3. When the figure in your dialogue says something that doesn't sit right with your conscious values, or makes a claim you're not sure you believe, practice pushing back within the dialogue itself rather than passively accepting it. Keep a simple log, 1 or 2 lines after each session, what came up, whether the dialogue surprised you, how you felt afterward, not as a performance metric, but as raw material for noticing patterns across the month. Days 15 through 21, look back at your log for recurring figures or themes. Most people find that certain images or characters return across multiple sessions rather than every session producing something entirely new, and this is the week to lean into any recurring figure specifically, treating it as a genuine developing relationship rather than a one-off exercise. Begin closing sessions with stage 4's physical ritual properly, even in small form. A single concrete action connected to whatever surfaced. Days 22 through 30, if the practice has felt genuinely productive and safe rather than destabilizing, this is a reasonable window to extend session length somewhat, or to try incorporating a second expressive channel, a simple drawing of a recurring figure, for instance, purely as an experiment. If at any point during this month a session has felt destabilizing rather than merely challenging, or if imaginal material has intruded outside of sessions you deliberately chose to begin, stop the practice and consider speaking with a mental health professional before continuing, regardless of what day of the 30 you're on. At the end of 30 days, the honest measures of progress look like this. Has dialogue started to feel less effortful and more genuinely surprising over the course of the month? Have you noticed real connections between what surfaces in sessions and material in your actual waking life? Relationships, decisions, long-standing patterns you hadn't previously examined directly? And has your ability to maintain stage 3's ethical friction, disagreeing with the material when something in it doesn't sit right, gotten more natural rather than staying effortful? If none of that has shifted after a genuine month of consistent practice, it's entirely possible this specific method isn't the right fit for you right now, and that's worth respecting rather than forcing. Dream journaling alone, straightforward talk therapy, or simply more time before returning to this kind of work are all legitimate alternatives, and I'd rather point you toward what actually serves you than insist on one method regardless of fit. If you want something more precise than a general impression to track across the month, a simple 2-part rating after each session, noted alongside the brief log described earlier, gives you something comparable across weeks rather than relying on memory alone, which tends to flatten or exaggerate how any single session actually felt. Rate, on a rough 0 to 10 scale, how surprising the dialogue felt, with 0 being entirely expected and scripted, and 10 being genuinely unlike anything you'd have consciously written, and separately rate how settled or unsettled you felt in the 10 minutes immediately after closing the session with stage 4. Early sessions often show a moderate surprise rating alongside a fairly settled after feeling, since the material at this stage tends to be relatively low stakes. As practice deepens, it's common and expected for the surprise rating to climb, and it's worth watching the settled rating specifically as your primary safety indicator throughout the process, not as an afterthought. A sustained pattern of low settled ratings, session after session, is exactly the kind of concrete, trackable signal that should prompt you to slow down, extend more time to stage 4's grounding ritual, or bring in outside support, rather than a vague sense that something feels off that's easy to talk yourself out of noticing in the moment. On troubleshooting specifically, the most common early obstacle is what practitioners across multiple traditions describe as the dialogue feeling fake written responses that clearly feel like the practitioner's own deliberate thinking rather than anything genuinely surprising. This is normal for the first several attempts and is not evidence the technique doesn't work for you. It typically resolves with sustained practice as the habitual, controlling voice of ordinary deliberate thought gradually relaxes its grip during sessions. The second common obstacle is the opposite problem: material that feels too vivid, too emotionally intense, arriving faster than feels manageable. If this happens, the correct response, consistent with how Jung's own successors have taught this method, is not to push through, but to deliberately close the session using stage 4. Ground yourself with something ordinary and physical, and consider whether this particular thread of material needs to be approached more slowly, in smaller doses, or with outside support rather than continued solo practice. The third obstacle, more subtle and easy to miss, is precisely the inflation risk described earlier. Sessions that leave you feeling not just interested or moved, but specially significant, uniquely insightful, or meaningfully superior to people who haven't done this kind of work. Treat that feeling itself as diagnostic information requiring more ethical friction in your next session, not confirmation that the practice is working unusually well. A fourth obstacle worth naming is simple inconsistency, which trips up more practitioners over the long run than any of the more dramatic problems already described. Some sessions, even well into sustained practice, will feel flat, mechanical, or entirely unproductive for no clear reason, and it's tempting, especially early on, to read a string of unproductive sessions as evidence the whole method has stopped working or was never really working in the first place. This variability is normal, well documented across the practitioner literature, and generally has more to do with ordinary factors: fatigue, a distracted day, unrelated stress crowding out the quiet attention the practice requires, than with anything wrong in how you're doing it. The fix is the same one that applies to most contemplative or reflective practices. Judge the trend across the log you've been keeping over weeks, not any individual session in isolation, and resist the urge to abandon a month-long structure on the strength of 2 or 3 difficult sittings early on. A fifth, more practical obstacle is simply timing sessions poorly. Attempting active imagination late at night when genuinely exhausted, for instance, tends to blur the important boundary between disciplined imaginative work and simple drowsy, uncontrolled drifting, making it harder to maintain Stage 3's ethical friction specifically. Most experienced practitioners find a session held earlier in the day, or at least at a point of reasonable alertness rather than at the ragged edge of fatigue, produces both richer material and a cleaner, more contained experience overall. As this becomes a longer-term practice, extending across months and years rather than a single 30-day trial, a few things tend to change, consistent both with what Jung's own later writing describes and with what contemporary Jungian analysts report observing in long-term clients. The dialogue itself tends to require less deliberate effort to initiate. The transition from invitation to genuinely autonomous feeling response happens more quickly and more reliably. Recurring figures tend to develop more consistent, recognizable personalities across sessions, becoming something closer to what Jung and his successors describe as genuine long-term inner relationships rather than one-off exercises. And for many long-term practitioners, the material gradually shifts in character. Early sessions often surface relatively immediate situational psychological content, while material arising after years of sustained practice more often engages the larger, more structural questions Jung himself was ultimately working through. How one's whole life is organized, what one actually values beneath surface-level daily concerns, how to hold mortality and meaning together rather than avoiding one or the other. If you want to go further than the beginner and intermediate structure covered here, there are several directly related practices worth knowing about, each with real depth of its own, rather than functioning as mere variations on a single trick. Von Franz's specific extension of active imagination into alchemical symbolism, documented across her books including material specifically titled Alchemical Active Imagination, offers a much older, more structured symbolic vocabulary for practitioners drawn to that particular tradition. Authentic movement, developed by Mary Starks Whitehouse and carried forward by later dance movement therapists, offers a full body-based practice for people whose inner material expresses more naturally through physical motion than through words or static imagery. Sand play therapy, developed by Dora Kalf, offers a concrete, tactile medium especially useful for people, including but not limited to children, who find pure verbal or visual dialogue too abstract or too exposing to access directly. And outside the Jungian tradition specifically, both internal family systems therapy, with its substantial clinical research base, and straightforward, consistent dream journaling, recording dreams immediately on waking, without interpretation, simply building a written record over months, offer accessible entry points that share real structural overlap with active imagination's core mechanism, without requiring the full formal technique. And for many long-term practitioners, the material gradually shifts in character. Early sessions often surface relatively immediate, situational psychological content, while material arising after years of sustained practice more often engages the larger, more structural questions Jung himself was ultimately working through: how one's whole life is organized, what one actually values beneath surface-level daily concerns, how to hold mortality and meaning together rather than avoiding one or the other. On integrating this into ordinary daily life more broadly, beyond formal sessions, several long-term practitioners describe developing an informal, much lighter version of the same underlying attention, carried into everyday moments rather than confined to a scheduled 20-minute block. Noticing a disproportionately strong reaction to something small during the day, irritation with a colleague that feels bigger than the situation warrants, a wave of sadness triggered by something minor, and treating that reaction itself as a small invitation, worth a private 30-second internal question rather than immediate dismissal or immediate reaction. This lighter, informal version doesn't replace the formal sessions described in the 30-day structure, but it extends the same underlying disposition, curiosity toward one's own unexplained inner material, rather than either suppression or unreflective acting out, into the ordinary texture of a day, which is in the end closer to what Jung meant by individuation than any single dramatic session could be on its own. Not an occasional deep excursion into the unconscious, followed by a return to an unchanged daily life, but a gradually shifting, ongoing relationship between conscious awareness and everything underneath it, carried consistently rather than visited occasionally. Where this goes for people who sustain it over years rather than months is not toward the dramatic, singular transformation content built around fear and urgency usually promises. Jung's own later life is the clearest available case study, and it's worth being accurate about what actually happened to him rather than romanticizing it. He did not remain in the intense, destabilizing state of the Red Book years indefinitely. Over the following decades, he redirected the same underlying method into increasingly structured scholarly and clinical work. His extensive later study of alchemical texts, which he came to see as a historical parallel tradition working through the same psychological material in symbolic form centuries before psychology existed as a discipline. His development of the broader theoretical framework of individuation, the lifelong process of integrating unconscious material into a more complete, more consciously examined sense of self, which he considered the central task of the second half of life specifically, and eventually, late in his career, more direct, controversial engagement with specifically theological questions, in works like his 1952 book Answer to Job, which returns openly to exactly the kind of confrontation with the darker, more ambiguous aspects of the divine that Abraxas had represented decades earlier in the Seven Sermons. Late in his life, reflecting back on the entire period, Jung himself described it as the source from which everything else in his work eventually flowed. The raw, difficult beginning that took him, in his own words, decades to properly work through and integrate into the more measured scientific language of his later published theory. That's the honest long-term trajectory, not a single dramatic revelation, but a lifetime of slow, careful, sometimes difficult translation of dangerous early material into something increasingly stable, increasingly examined, and increasingly useful to himself first, and eventually through the professional field he helped build, to a great many other people who never had to walk directly through what he walked through in order to benefit from the map he brought back. Before closing, it's worth naming where to go if you want to study this seriously, rather than only practice it. Because a technique detached from its actual sources drifts quickly into whatever the next person retelling it wants it to mean. The Red Book itself, published in 2009 as Liber Novus with Sonu Shamdasani's extensive scholarly introduction and notes, is the primary source, though it's a genuinely demanding text, both in length and in the density of its symbolic material, and most people are better served starting elsewhere first. Jung's own autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, published shortly after his death in 1962, remains the most accessible first-hand account of this whole period in his own words, written for a general audience rather than a specialist one, and includes the full text of the Seven Sermons as an appendix. Robert Johnson's inner work, published in 1986, remains the clearest, most practically usable introduction to the actual four-step technique for a reader with no clinical background at all. Marie-Louise von Franz's writing, particularly her work extending active imagination into alchemical material, is the right next step for anyone drawn specifically to that deeper symbolic tradition. And Stephen Holler's The Gnostic Jung and the Seven Sermons to the Dead offers the most direct, sustained scholarly treatment connecting Jung's private visionary material back to its actual historical Gnostic roots, including the specific argument that Abraxas functions, structurally, as Jung's own version of the ancient Demiurge. None of these sources require joining anything or trusting a single online interpreter standing between you and the material. That independence was, in the end, the entire point of Jung's own decades-long insistence on working through this material directly, in his own hand, on his own terms, before he trusted anyone else's summary of what it meant. If something in your own dreams or waking imagination has been knocking at the door lately, a recurring figure, an image you can't quite explain, a feeling that something in you wants to be heard directly rather than analysed from a safe distance, you now have an actual, historically grounded, carefully bounded method for approaching it, built by a man who took the risks of doing so more seriously than almost anyone before or since, precisely because he nearly lost his own footing finding it out. Try the compressed version once, honestly, without expecting to encounter your own Abraxas on the first attempt. Jung's own material took years of disciplined, patient work before it produced anything like the Seven Sermons. And most of what active imagination actually does, for most people, most of the time, is much quieter than that. A slow, cumulative deepening of the relationship between what you consciously know about yourself and what you don't yet. If the compressed version feels genuinely useful, the 30-day structure is there to test it properly. And if what surfaces ever starts to feel less like disciplined inner work and more like something you can't close the door on when you choose to, take that as seriously as Jung eventually insisted his own students take it, and get real support rather than pushing through alone. You are not uniquely equipped to face down a demiurge by yourself. You are a human being with an unconscious, using a method a braver than average psychiatrist spent 16 dangerous years building, carefully, specifically so that the rest of us wouldn't have to build it entirely from scratch, alone on a train, watching Europe drown in a vision no one else could see. It's worth ending on the detail that outlasts every dramatic image in this story, because it's the truest one. The last word Jung ever wrote in the actual red leather folio of Liber Novus, left unfinished after 16 years of work, was a single German word, Möglichkeit. Possibility, not resolution, not triumph, not a final answer to the question of what Philemon or Abraxas ultimately were. Just possibility, left open on the final page of a book its own author could never quite bring himself to finish or fully explain, even to the people closest to him. That's a more honest place to end than any promise of transformation could be. The unconscious in Jung's own account of it was never a problem to be solved once and then set aside. It was a lifelong relationship, undertaken carefully, revised constantly, never fully closed, and the method covered in this video is simply the most carefully documented set of tools anyone has ever built for beginning that relationship deliberately, rather than only meeting it by accident, at 3 a.m, in a dream you don't understand and have no idea what to do with.